Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho.
Well, welcome again to a special edition this time of Gloucester Bookies. We're here to talk about writing books, reading books, anything you can do with books. And I'm pleased that my guest today is really, I'll call it multimedia. He's an artist in Rockport named David Arsenault. David, hello, and thank you very much
Hi, Wayne.
for coming.
Great to be here.
Good. I'm delighted. And he's got books in front of him. I've got books in front of me. But we're going to talk about that dividing line in which people who write attempt to wrestle with and bring down big game, which is art. What it is to paint a painting, what it is to see as an artist sees. Those kind of things are hard to write about. And yet there's some people who succeed. I don't mean that I've succeeded. I'm going to test with David, and I've asked him, I've got to tell you, I've met him and I know. David is an extremely modest and diplomatic person in life. And it will be very hard for him to, if I made mistakes in this book on Ed and Joe about the way artists do their business, he's going to have a hard time expressing any criticism or finding that, Wayne, you're all wet and wrong. So I'm encouraging, so don't blame him, blame me. If you find him finally saying out loud, Wayne, no, you're wrong, that's not right, the real way that, so hopefully we'll have that kind of an explosion, and it's detonated by me and my errors. I thank you. David, if I can, our audience is extremely interested because of Gloucester's connection and Edward Hopper, especially in 1923 and 2023. Edward Hopper, which is representative of an enormous book by Gail Levin, Edward Hopper, an intimate biography. She's the world expert. In fact, any library, including all those in Cape Ann, will have this book by Gail Levin. I'm sitting next to a person who, A, is interested in Edward Hopper, B, when he paints, has been compared with Edward Hopper, C, has interviewed Gail Levin. Is that all true?
It's all true.
All right.
It's all true.
I'd like you to join the viewers and me with something that we have prepared, a video. I think it's only 2 minutes or so you kindly provided about Edward Hopper, and then you and I will converse a little about this, what we see in the video, which also will depict some of Edward Hopper's paintings.
Indeed.
So I guess we'll say in Hollywood language, let's roll it. We'll see the video on Edward Hopper now. Now, David, you've seen this, in fact, you sent me this 2-minute clip.
I did.
And it's an advertisement for, I think, an exhibition or something with Edward Hopper.
It's related to an exhibition about Edward Hopper, but it's a video that is kind of a standalone commodity. The gentleman who created it is someone who wanted to tell the story, and the story is one that relates very nicely with the Whitney Museum's exhibition that's coming up. In fact, it's already opened in the Whitney.
I'll ask the viewers to think back what they just saw. There was a moment in which somebody was standing at a gas pump, and it had that nice red old-fashioned gas pump in front of a little dwelling along the road. Otherwise, just this one person. In fact, although it's called, I guess, gas,
Yes.
There's nobody else around. It's not like he's gassing up a car or the car is still there. It's apparently before or after or between or something. He's dealing with the gas pumps. That painting, that particular painting, has a link that's close to you in life. I'd like you to share with the audience what gas meant to you.
It changed my life.
Changed your life.
At the time, I didn't know it. I discovered it when I was a library assistant in middle school, and I was shelving books. And this was a brand new book that Time Life had just published on American realist painting from 1900 to 1970. And I was just flipping through it before I put it on the shelf, and I came across a couple of pieces by Hopper, and that particular one kind of riveted me. It was an image that it almost felt as if I had discovered myself in a way that I hadn't even realized I was. As if I had created this world that was in a picture form that just spoke to me like, here's something important, here's something kind of integral to the experience of being alive. I was a 12-year-old, so I wasn't any great philosopher or anything like that, but it was something that just spoke to me in such a direct way as nothing that I had ever experienced before in my life that I can recall.
Oh, what do you call those kind of illuminating moments?
Kind of aha.
Eureka. I don't know what.
Eureka is one word for sure. Yeah.
Anyhow,
Yes.
that happened to you. That immediacy, that moment. In this painting, with this painting, gas. Now, that was 12 years old.
Yeah.
You put it in the shelves for other people to get that book.
I took it out a few times.
And you took it out a few times, and you did your thing. And I understand you even became a graphic artist.
Ultimately,
as a career.
I did.
And then when you were doing that enough years, you said something like to yourself, you'll put the right words together. A lot of other people are telling me kind of what to design or draw or make happen, and where do I come into this picture, literally? Tell us more.
That covers it pretty well. I went to graphic school because I finally realized after many years doing a lot of other things, including, as I mentioned earlier, being a disc jockey. I worked for a talent agency, did voiceovers and did on-camera work and things like that. And I did a lot of other things too that I don't necessarily feel compelled to share, just because you have to make money. You're paying for your house, you have a family and all. Ultimately, I finally realized that art thing. I kind of was good at that, and I kind of liked doing it. And so maybe I can find a way to make a living doing that. And so being a pragmatist at the time, I thought, okay, I'll go to graphic school. I was working for an educational publisher. It related to a number of things that were done in the company, and so they paid for it. And in the midst of my early studies in graphic design school, thankfully, they still taught hand skills, which included painting and drawing and studio work. I had a teacher who actually introduced us to the perspective section of one of the classes, and she showed us this book, Edward Hopper, The Art and the Artist, and in it, this is a Gale Levin book too.
Gale
Levin.
Levin.
An exhibition in 1980. This is like the catalog from that exhibition.
Right.
There's a painting in there which people would recognize because it's Prospect Street, Gloucester.
Prospect Street.
And that was our perspective lesson. And when I saw that and I saw who the artist was, after class, I raced to the school library. I found that book, and I found as much as I could on Hopper and devoured it and felt like I had come home again. That was like the connection that brought me back to that 12-year-old had been excited about an image for the first time.
I see. So many years apart, but 12 years old, running into Edward Hopper's gas painting, and then years later in graphic arts school with Gail Levin's book. This is before you met her or interviewed her.
Yes.
But yeah, may I say, I'm inviting the viewers who are interested. This is a kindness by David. His interview of Gail Levin, which I've read and I think fascinating. I wish more people would have an opportunity to read it, and he's kindly granted that. If you'll write me at the email address at the end of the program and ask, I will be able to send you a link that you can obtain and see the interview that David had, a wonderful interview that David had with Gail Levin, including, I'm going to say this, it's one of the juiciest parts, most interesting to me. Apparently there was a gardener or a landscaper that helped Edward Hopper in his Cape Cod home.
Their handyman.
Named Tommy Gray.
Tommy Gray.
An old man. And when Tommy Gray passed away, Edward Hopper made a comment. Do you recall that? It was poor Tommy Gray.
Yeah, he can
He'll no longer see the sunlight.
Yeah. Yes.
Now that is, to me, like breathtaking. The artist, who was a man of few words, rarely spoke.
Yes.
Equating death with the most awful pity thing that you could imagine would be you no longer can see the sunlight. And Edward Hopper said, poor Tommy Gray, he won't be able to see the sunlight.
Yes.
You have paintings, and you play a lot with both light and shadows.
Very much so.
Because you can't have light without the shadows, right?
It's a partnership, absolutely.
And I'm going to quote now. This is what we started out saying we'll do. From Ed and Joe. You're welcome to look and read on with me if you wish. On page 241, I need my glasses, I believe. Page 241. Just a short thing about shadows, in which his temporary landlady in Gloucester talks with Edward Hopper. All right, let's see. After she asked and he declined more coffee, she volunteered, I've seen you walking in big strides when the weather is cloudy, and hesitating, I'd say, when it is so bright. Ed realized that his landlady was a close observer despite her vision problems. I hesitate, feeling challenged and wondering if I'm up to it. Shadows are harder work, Ed said. Shadows are the hardest work, I'd say. I've had my share of shadows, Mr. Hopper, let me tell you, Mrs. Post said. Yes. Shadows and light. Tell us about your struggles with. Is that at all evocative to you? That you kind of nod that that's realistic. It is difficult, or is that kind of my gloss as an author on something I don't know much about?
I would say I would have a contrary opinion about that.
Yay!
Only because.
He's doing it. Thank you. Thank you.
Only because I feel that he really had an intense desire to find and express the light. And I think on some level he understood that he had a real mastery of doing so. And I agree with the fact that the shadows are work, because if you don't do them successfully, then you're not telling the story of the light as well. They are a foil for each other. They both have to balance each other. And yet, I also think that that's where the story lives. I think that's where the story lives. And he was a master at it. I think he knew that. I think he recognized that he had a way of expressing light that people really responded to. And I think it was not as hard for him as it was for other people because he had a particular way of approaching it. And I don't know exactly what that was because he never talked about process other than in very abstract ways. And he didn't invite people into his studio to see him work. He was a very private person. But it's clear from the work that he did over and over and over again that he knew what he was doing with light, and he had something to say about it. And I think, even though in my interview with Gail, she felt when I brought up the subject of light as a possible spiritual aspect of being human, she felt, well, he doesn't really relate to religion or to religionists. I thought maybe even if he couldn't articulate that, and he was a very articulate person, or wouldn't articulate it because he didn't want to, I think there was something about the light that felt like it had all of the meaning in the world. And I think that relates very well to that comment you brought up about Tommy Gray. The fact that he felt all was lost for Tommy now because he couldn't see that sunlight. And to Hopper, that was the meaning for his existence. One of his greatest quotes was, "All I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house."
Wonderful quote.
Yeah.
Say that again, because people might be intrigued by this. Yeah. This is something he said of his art in a general way, but I think it's very true of his Gloucester paintings.
Oh,
please.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, simply, and he was trying to paint in a very simple way. All I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house.
All I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also in my book, I talked about this painting of Prospect Street, and I'd like to go to that in two ways. I know that you have studied with Charlie Mavalli.
Briefly, yes.
And Charlie Mavalli has painted Gloucester, among many artists, but Charlie Mavalli is well known to the people who are seeing this. Charlie Mavalli most often was outside. I guess they call it en plein air.
En plein air.
In French.
Hopper called it from the fact.
From the fact. Painting outside. So he would set up his easel in Lane's Cove and paint away under the sky in that sunlight you're talking about.
Yeah.
Other artists, I think including Edward Hopper, have a studio, and they'll paint their storm in an environment that's controlled.
Me too.
Where they can, and you too.
Me too.
So I'd like you to respond to this about the difference between, well, you're on Prospect Street at a particular time. You're gathering materials to bring back to, let me just read it aloud.
Yeah.
Page 266, and ask you to respond to it, please. 266. The Lady of Good Voyage Church is referred to in this section without saying Lady of Good Voyage Church. And I'm just going to say page 266, about the middle of the page. The twin church steeples, like upside-down bluebell flowers, emphasize the sky from below, less pointing than nudging the viewer's eyes upward. It was a cloudless blue sky day, but Ed was going to whiten the heavens himself, a sort of airy fogginess or mist that invited anyone to consider that one's future is invisible, uncertain, without form, to be announced later. What was here was an automobile with a spare tire handy, if needed, beside the stalwart armory. We all remember the armory. If needed, on a street to the church when needed. Done with his sketch, satisfied with very few touch-ups that he had a composition that worked, balancing the big old armory on one side against, he made the street wider and more inviting than it was in scale, the eclectic row of houses curled up to the turn right to the church. He planned the sky perfectly, he judged, in having just so much but no more, and as he left the paper for a white sky or added a touch or two of titanium white, he could always change his mind. The blue of the steeple domes on the church, however, should be exactly enough. But he would keep an open mind. And there's where he goes back to New York City and does the painting. Back in New York, he turned it into an oil painting, drained it of its blue. Even the iconic church domes he turned golden and exercised that Midas touch all over the resulting oil, imbuing the canvas with autumn colors. The trees were not green, but amber and suggestive of September. He was so pleased with the car parked in front of the armory with its wonderful spinning spare tire and a canvas top with an elongated oval window that he lopped off the armory altogether and stopped the right-hand side with that automobile. He was excited enough to duplicate the same worthy car ahead down the road in shadow. It came out poorly, as if a fly had landed on the painting. He left the imperfection as a smudgy and too small echo of the great motif of the car in front of the armory. So the composition had meaning, and its defect had a function too. Please feel free to tear it apart.
Well, interestingly enough, the chronology is different.
Yep.
He did not create the oil immediately. In fact, he created the oil 6 years later.
The Prospect Street one was 6 years after he had been to
Yeah,
Gloucester.
and in fact, the Prospect Street painting was done, at least according to Levin's catalog raisonné, it was done in 1928,
Right.
5 years later. And then in 1934, and it's the only case that I've seen in his studies where he actually did the same subject again in an oil painting.
Right.
It's the only time I know.
Terrific.
And I think he was kind of struggling at the time to try to find a little bit more momentum to go forward. He wanted to reach back to the Gloucester years when he had so much success. That was the show of the work that he created in 1923 that is the core of your book, is what allowed him to finally become the full-time painter he really deeply desired.
I don't want to minimize that, and I think you can speak to this too. He was 40 years old. He'd been an illustrator primarily.
Yeah.
He hated it.
Yep.
Other people were telling him what to paint. He was being commissioned. He made a living, but bare living. He hadn't sold an oil painting in 10 years
Right.
when he came to Gloucester in the summer of 23.
Yeah.
And yet he had this marvelous success, largely from Joe Nivison, his new friend
Absolutely.
and ultimately his bride.
Yeah.
And he could make a living as an artist, he decided, and he made that turn, 90 degrees or 180 degrees,
Yeah, maybe 180.
from illustrator to fine artist.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sitting beside a gentleman who made that brave turn himself from graphic designer,
Yeah.
making a living,
Yeah.
and just going and say, I'm going to be a fine artist. And I'd like you to talk to that. You're in there. Your experience is a reenactment of Edward Hopper's.
That's it.
So,
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
yeah,
Clever way.
yeah. Thank you.
It was a kind of a matter of faith and trust. After the experience of doing advertising for the publisher for a number of years and getting a certain diminishing return on what I felt was the creative aspect that I had craved in a profession, after finally getting to that place. The more I did it, the more I started thinking about the painting that I was introduced to in graphic school in the early years in studio classes. And more I thought that I owed it to myself to do some more work in that area and to investigate it and to see if there was something in there for me. Not just, this is fun, but can I do something to make people feel something with the things I make? In the way that Hopper's gas painting had that effect on me. Could I do something meaningful in the realm of painting that would not only allow me to have a certain voice, I guess, but primarily to then go to the next level and make that my occupation to support not just myself, but my family. That became the ultimate goal, and I had to do it. And I was lucky enough to work for somebody who was a frustrated painter, who allowed me to take classes during the workday in the studio.
I admire what you did, and I have to add that people out there might like to know, because you credited them. Cape Ann artists exist as a community.
Yes.
And if you approach them and ask them for some help, not any more than information, which is how can you make a living here as an artist? What are the tips? What are the ideas? I guess what is the market here? Things about art and about business. You did that. You made an exploration. I won't say you made a leap of faith exactly, because you explored first, and I guess you credit local artists with giving you information, even sharing with you how much they could earn or what.
Yeah. When we first came here as visitors in 2013, yeah.
I think, and you moved around. I think you were first in Bearskin Neck.
Yeah, for my first 2 seasons, right?
And then you have the gallery now in Dock Square.
Yep.
And enormous, really, when you go inside. All of the
good-sized space.
paintings. Good size space. And colonial, is it? It just go back to...
Yes, it is 1740. It's one of the oldest in town.
Older than me, I'll tell you. That's
Me
it.
too.
All right.
And people love the building as much as they hopefully enjoy the work inside.
Yes. You studied for a bit, enviably, with Charles Movaly. And I'd like to quote from him. Please, folks, if you have a chance to get to the library, you've got to understand that Charles Movaly was not only a great painter, but an author of many books, an editor of books for artists. This one is an example. It's called Groupie, obviously Emil Groupie, who was in Bearskin Neck, not Bearskin Neck, Rocky Neck. Groupie on Color. And Groupie's paintings are in here, I mean, there's hundreds of paintings. And all of them have these comments on how behind the scenes of the artist's comments. And a lot of this is useful to a hobbyist painter as well as to even professionals. But Charles Movaly is giving you the accurate story. And anyone who simply wants to look at the pictures, you go ahead, because it's a pleasure. Yeah. Charles Movaly, when the Cape Ann Museum had an exhibition of Charles Movaly paintings, it's called Cape Ann and Beyond. They made 2017. They made a wonderful, short, concise book, including quotations from Charles Movaly. First, you didn't study a long time with him because you were a late arriver in terms of, he was at the end of his career. Tell me more.
I was just at the beginning of my career. And so I studied with him when he was doing workshops around the country. One of the places he visited was upstate New York, a place called Greenville Arms, which was a very popular place for a lot of artists like Charles, who could not only paint, but teach people how to paint, that they would go there and do workshops. And it was in 1997 that I had the opportunity to attend one of Charlie's workshops at that location for a week. And it was a great experience. He had a group, about a dozen people, and it was a variety of skills. Some people that were just novices, or as they like to call them, Sunday painters, and other people who were professionals, and everything in between, and incredible diversity of ages as well. And he worked with all of us. He was able to be patient with everyone in all different kinds of circumstances, and to communicate very clearly, I thought, and also with a great sense of humor, what he understood in that 7-day workshop. It was really a joy to experience, and he gave us all an opportunity on one of our dinner evenings to show a slide presentation of some of the work that we had done, so he could learn more about us and kind of give us some insight into what he saw about what we were doing.
A delightful man. We miss him. I'd like to just see if it echoes some of the experience you had with Charlie Movaly, to hear his voice in quotations here. By the way, it says in his instance, he had no formal training as an artist. He basically self-taught. I thought a genius, self-taught. Mm-hmm. Anyhow,
absolutely,
the work that he did.
Yeah.
I'd like to share. I met his widow, who kindly shared with me an anecdote, a true story, about how she, I don't know if you've heard this, how she and Charlie met?
No.
All right.
No.
Dale Radcliffe.
Yeah.
She's an artist as
I
well.
know Dale. I know Dale.
She,
Very nice.
Well, this should vouch for this story. She was at the building center. I think she was at the counter serving. She was like a cashier at the building center. And artists do all kinds of jobs besides whatever they're doing as artists. And Charlie came by. Charlie probably was buying some big house paintbrushes, because sometimes artists use those too. Something in the building center. And when he came up to the counter, he thought she was a nice person. So he asked if she might be interested in going out on whatever. And she said, well, no, I've just gone through a tough time. It was a divorce. I've gone a tough time. I'm not ready. So he's ever, Charlie, down to earth. He said, well, when would you be ready? And she said, about a year. So he said, okay. Now, I don't know if he wrote this down when he was in front of her. It's like 1 year, Dale Radcliffe, and the date, or when he got home. In any case, and she swears by this, is a true story, 1 year later, to the day, he contacted her and said, it's been a year. And she and he had that first date.
Great.
And everything fell into place. The moon and the stars were right, and they had a wonderful long-term marriage.
That's awesome.
Anyway,
that's a great story.
this is Charlie Mavalli. Now remember, he's doing interviews with people like Emile Groupé, Roger Curtis, other Cape Ann artists. And he says, when I started talking to Emile Groupé and Roger Curtis, I knew something about painting. But these two masters forced me to think. Same thing happened when I worked with Betty Lou Schlem, the famous Rockport watercolorist. These three painters all stressed the fundamentals. And I thought, he's very humble, but they were too. They were stressing the fundamentals. I guess, did you find that to be true in his classes, or do you find it necessary to practice your art? That your focus is on fundamentals, and it might not be. You can now say, Charlie, you're wrong.
No. I mean, there are certain things that you must do if you're going to create interesting pictures to look at, that hopefully engage the viewer's mind and heart, and connect them, because it's not just about us. It's about, if you're going to be creating representation, it's about the viewer. If you don't create something that they can relate to in some way that reminds them of a thought they've had, or a feeling they've had, a place they've been, a moment in time, then you really haven't done your job, in my opinion, for a representational painter. It has to be part of their experience too, in some way. And if they can't get into it, then you didn't do your job well. My opinion.
Well, opinion, you're acting on it. I can vouch for that from your paintings. You address the audience. You are very, I mean, your canvases come out at us when we're looking at it. And I think you said this just a moment ago about two-way communication. You're conscious, I guess, when you're painting, that you're not just transmitting. You're expecting to be received.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself a filter of sorts, I guess.
A filter.
A filter. Yeah.
Good.
There's an idea arrives, be it from a personal experience, almost exclusively for me, or perhaps something that I've decided to include into an experience I've had, which is unrelated, but I think can be related. Then there's that experience of, how do I make this feel as true to the idea as I can? But the goal is always, will it have an opportunity for someone else to connect? It can't just be something that I think, boy, aren't I special? Hang it on my wall to live with, so I can continue to feel how special I am. It's not that.
People will not realize that you're in their head when you go around town. I understand. Tell the story right. I won't. I just know it's some. You used to drive by. I probably still drive by a particular house. It captivated you. You made photographs of the house. I don't know if it's a summer house or a permanent residence. And you knew you were going to someday paint it. I don't know how many years before you finally did paint it. I think, did you paint it as a large? Was it a large painting or not? But in any case, tell us about, you're driving around and you see this, it captures your eye, and you feel like you're going to do something with it. You take photographs of it, you think about it, and you think about how you're going to, as you said, communicate this, what you're in your head and heart, to an audience. Tell us more about that. If you remember the house that you
I'm not sure which one you're referring to because I've painted so many houses.
Sort of, you're right. Sort of on the ocean. It's got a pillar on a porch. Two. I think it's called The Conversation or something. There's
Overdue Conversation.
Overdue Conversation.
Yeah, that's a piece that I thought about.
You drove by this?
I drive past it twice a day, every day.
Twice a day, every day,
yeah.
And you're thinking about it. You take your photographs of it.
Yep.
This is all before you put a brush to
Absolutely,
canvas.
yeah. And I never know exactly what will trigger the idea emerging at the top of the pile, because there's always a lot of things I'm thinking about that I've seen and experienced. And there's a constant shuffling and almost kind of an argument in my head as to which one is going to emerge as the next idea that needs to be expressed. That one, when I moved to Annisquam with my wife when she became the pastor of the Annisquam Village Church, I started driving past that house all the time, twice a day. And there was a thing about it that I really appreciated, but it's not on the water like I put it in the painting. It needed to serve an idea. And the more I thought about it, the more I decided it wasn't going to be where it sits. I decided that it needed to be, because I painted it in 2020, it needed to be more a storytelling kind of a piece, whereby overdue conversations could be held by the water because the water has a calming effect on people. It's a place that people love to go even if they don't know why they love to go there. And it's also a place where I placed two chairs facing each other on the porch so that the circumstances were ripe for that conversation. And it didn't matter who that conversation was going to be with.
Yes.
But we all have, in my mind, everyone I know has a conversation that is overdue, either with a spouse or with a friend, or the culture has a lot of conversations that need to be held collectively. I thought it was an idea whose time had come, and it took about 2 years before I finally did make a canvas out of it. It would have taken as long as 20 years before an idea has actually been painted.
This gentleman, David Arsenault, I must say, he's just referred to relocating a house which isn't on the ocean next to the sea. But beautiful example of that. One of the first paintings I think you did of Gloucester was your something about sunlight or light inside. It's an interior, but it's got a window, and the window overlooks, you said, a parking lot. It was actually a parking lot, and you changed that into an idyllic, wonderfully green, nice, inviting, I guess Martha's Vineyard or somewhere else.
Yes.
You tell us more about that process.
That's
where you relocate, you fantasize and make it happen.
It's the place that I lived at the time was a temporary transition space. The only time in my whole life I lived in an apartment, and it was in upstate New York, and it was the year I had been divorced. And I really didn't like the apartment. I didn't like the circumstances because my kids were only with me part-time.
Except in the morning.
Except in the morning when the sunlight streamed in through the 3 windows and landed on a floor which must have been polyurethane 30, 50, 100 times. I don't know how many. It was so thick and it was so shiny. And it created this amazing sense of both glare and reflection. And I had to describe both the glare and the reflection because it was in 2 different places, vertically for the reflection and the sunlight streaks on the floor at an angle because of the position of the sun.
What did you call that painting?
Apartment by the Sea.
Apartment by the Sea.
Apartment by the Sea in Latham, New York, which is nowhere near the sea. But I needed to be there.
Yes.
Martha's Vineyard was a place that for me was a place of rest and respite and eventually a place of inspiration. for about 20 years in my life with my family.
Yeah.
And so I needed it. And so there wasn't a chance in hell I was going to paint the
Parking
parking lot that was outside, because it was not special in any way, shape, or form.
If I gather it, the feeling you had about this morning sunlight, you felt would be expressed by a window that overlooked the sea. For that calming influence.
Yeah,
Good,
yeah, exactly
good.
right.
All right, I'm going to again back to Charlie Magali. He had some marvelous quotes today. The great paintings are not meticulously done. He talks about lost edges, and it doesn't make linear. What's your feeling on that?
It worked great for Charlie. I mean, it really did. He had such a masterful sense of design. He knew how to make marks and make them sing and make them in a very direct and very expedient way. And I learned a long time ago about myself, courtesy of my mom.
You're more realistic.
I'm not only more realistic, but I'm really slow in almost everything I do in life.
Meticulous.
And I am meticulous because in my mind, light and edges are a very direct relationship. And so if I'm painting something like the interior of a room, which has walls, and it's coming through, the sunlight is coming through a window, which is rectilinear, then there's going to be a certain shape that's going to come from that. It's going to be a rectangle, it's going to be an oblique or something at an angle, a parallelogram, whatever. It's going to be a shape that's got a precision to it. And it's only fuzzy the further away you get from it. Near where the sun first hits, it's very, very precise if you look at a highlight on the floor, for example. And I find the juxtaposition of the shadow and the light to be very compelling. And I want it to be what I think I see, and I think I see it with a certain kind of precision. Doesn't mean everything in my paintings is precise. In fact, I think having hard edges and soft shapes like clouds and trees, leaves, and different things that are fuzzier is important because it helps balance out the whole composition, and it gives resting places for the eye so that it's not all very precise.
What you see, what your eyes do, and what you think about, it seems like it might be at least sometimes a conflict. So I'm going to read this from Charlie Magali. When a painter thinks he's done for, perfection is the enemy of great art. He's quoting another painter. Make a few mistakes. What do you think?
I think I make mistakes every painting I make. I think anybody who doesn't isn't being honest.
I don't know if Betty Lou somebody, there's such a thing as a happy accident. Right?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And those are the ones where you actually learn something that you can use going forward, if you recognize them.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not just, boy, doesn't that look great overall. If you recognize that you did something by accident and it actually worked out, then you've got something new to add to your toolbox.
I don't want to stump you, but can you give us an example that we could understand, that you can translate into words? Because I know it's probably a visual thing.
Yeah.
If not, don't worry. I've got a quote from Ed and Joe.
Okay. I think that's where we're going here.
Let me go to...
Nothing is jumping out at me.
Let me go to Ed and Joe. Okay, here. Here it is. 131. Page 131. He's looking at some shacks in Lanes Cove. Are not great houses. Some of the people live in them, but it's not the lobster shacks we're talking about. It's the regular houses, but they're not great. This was an artist's theme, Ed thought, although no artist was at work capturing the day here before it went away. How many artists in New York would curse themselves that they were in bed and not in Lanes Cove on this day? If Ed did not take on the passing scene, it would not be remembered in a month, let alone in 100 years. Building not for the day, but for centuries, he turned toward houses in the distance. They addressed his condition exactly. They stood like hungry dogs looking at someone not in the picture, seeking attention that they were not being given. The jokey title, Gloucester Mansions, came to mind. These houses were mansions in training, wishful mansions, envious haunts of broken dreams. This was the prey he was stalking. Lanesville would live. I was going to ask you what you have here for us with the books. Oh, you have Lanesville Mansions.
Well, I have
You do.
Lanesville Shacks at Lanesville.
Shacks at Lanesville.
Yeah.
That's clearly Lanes Cove.
Yep.
At that curve in the road.
Yeah, this is the building with now, he talks about shark jaws or something.
Camera.
He talks about shark jaws hanging off this building here
Yes.
now, but now it's tuna tails is what it's on it.
Tuna tails.
Tuna tails on the
Right.
on the front of the building.
Well, the more things change, the more they can.
And I think what's interesting about that quote is that Hopper, one of the things that made his work is that he would look at the things that nobody else wanted to look at, but he had a way of making them feel extraordinary, even though they were just ordinary. Things like the shacks, for example. But one of the things in Gail Levin's biography, the book that you have there, when they talk about his travels to Gloucester in that year of 1923, he was looking at the houses and all of the other artists that he was with, other than Joe. Joe was looking at the flowers. They were all looking at the sea. They were looking at the ships. They were looking at the seascape. He had that feeling about painting sunlight on the side of a house. And he couldn't shake it, and he didn't want to shake it, and he thought there was something in there for him. And he was determined to go after it, and go after it, and go after it.
Speaking of the Mansard House, let me do it. This is a nice segue to the Mansard, the famous
Mansard roof.
Mansard,
Yes.
Mansard roof,
Yeah.
Mansard roof. I think I mistitled it in my book here, which is good. Catch an error. Okay, 246. Okay. This, well, if you, well, this is the picture.
This is the painting we're talking about. The
we're
one
talking
on this
about
left side page
of
here.
a house either in or near Rocky Neck.
It's in Rocky Neck.
In Rocky Neck.
Yep.
And people live in it now.
Yep.
And I'm sure they wouldn't want us to call attention to it or have a crowd stand around and look at their house. But this, people can look at the painting. So this is the Mansard roof. All right. Let me do this quotation. You've got this, and people at home can sometimes find these on, if you just go search in the Mansard roof.
Brooklyn Museum is where it resides, so you could go to their website and see it.
It will come up.
Yep.
This daffy Mansard-roofed bazaar was a playground for Ed's muses, all of them. The lugubrious, the ludicrous, the baffled, the thoughtful, the Janus-faced muse that found beauty in ugliness and ugliness in beauty. His favorite of all of his muses, they played Ed were. The taming of the Mansard roof, or such its title would be, was no small task. It had to be broken down if this wild house was to be broken down at all. Ed crammed the pages of his notebook with pieces of roof and window and stair and side as he took in bits, as it seemed on paper to disintegrate, as it became no house at all, but so many items in the air over a juggler's head. He thought, assemble it later. He would retain, though, its eclectic stew of this and that, now and then, here and there. Nothing really matched, but all bubbled and boiled in a white heat on this windy day, naming him as the artist anointed to weave its moving pieces into the glance of a moment, to grant the house life on canvas, a rest that the house had never in life known, nor ever would. Is that a depiction of some of the thoughts you have or kind of thinking you do when you get it right and you get this house or interior correct?
I think he probably, and in my opinion, he probably did take on the painting in that day. he would have had he was in the early stages of getting enthralled with watercolor, something that his girlfriend at the time, Jo, had just introduced him to. And I would think that he would have been compelled to try to do it to the best of his ability in that moment. Because I believe, even though he was not an excitable person, he was pretty low-key, some would say morose. He still would have had a certain energy inside, a certain strong compilation that he must do something with this, because it was so interesting and so different, I think, than a lot of what he had experienced. And that house, I painted it too. That house has a lot of character to it. And I can understand why the light and the experience of the motion and the moment would have really kind of enraptured him and made him want to do something with that. He could have finished it in the studio sometime later, but I think he would have been energized in a way that later in his career wasn't so much energized. She used to have to kind of coerce him to get painting. He'd rather sit and look at his Civil War books. And he got to a point when he was a studio painter later in his career, which was mostly the 40s, 50s, and 60s, he would paint no more than 5 paintings a year.
Wow.
In the watercolor years, you look at the list of all the watercolors he created in the 20s and the 30s,
Yes.
and even into the early 40s, it was prolific. For him, it was dozens and dozens.
Well, it kind of reminds me of this, almost like a genie in a bottle, where you're pressed in and compressed and you don't have any outlet, and then suddenly somebody takes the stopper off the bottle and you're out there.
Yeah.
That's Ed Hopper, the illustrator, suddenly gone, not gone mad, but running amok, I guess, is right in the 20s with the opportunity to paint away.
And she took the cork out of the bottle.
She
for
took
him
the cork
by
out of the
introducing him to that media. Think of it in the context of the 20s. Men, I mean, this is 3 years after women won the right to vote.
Yes.
Men were considered the lords and masters, essentially, in the culture. In the art world, especially, were they considered to be the only ones whose work was worth talking about, with very, very few exceptions. For him to let her teach him about art would have been a demonstration of vulnerability that he wouldn't shared with many people.
Mm-hmm.
He had a goal with her. I think he saw something that he ultimately ended up wanting to be with for the rest of his life. But he also saw that she was an artist who was opening doors herself, even as he couldn't. You know, as you mentioned earlier, 10 years he hadn't sold a painting.
Right.
By getting a chance to try something new, which he almost immediately seemed to have gotten facility with, she gave him a sense of new life. And she started introducing him in New York to some of the new venues that he hadn't been able to get into, like the Brooklyn Museum, where he sold the mansard roof painting.
In your interview with Gail Levin, it seems to me, your memory would be better than mine. You asked Gail Levin if Edward Hopper probably would have been surprised to be so remembered, so famous, even after his death. And she said, probably not. He probably thought he was that good.
Yeah.
But the biographer, which was herself, he might be a little angry at his biographer because she brought out Jo Nivison. No, her contribution.
She led with Jo Nivison, essentially.
I think you both laughed over in the interview, or both laughed over the idea that he would be so.
Yeah.
Don't tell my secret that it's Jo Nivison.
It would have been, for him, a devastating secret to be out. That she had gotten him much of what he ended up taking with and running with. Once the art world started seeing what he was doing, he was off to the races. But until she started opening those doors for him, he was a best-kept secret.
Well, I'm going to do one more quote and I'll ask you, and it has to do with details. You mentioned your attentiveness to details, and I'm just going to. This one is on page 275. He spent a few minutes reluctantly because he felt the minutes as if they were a small bank account that he was spending at an awful rate an account that would be gone before he put brush to paint. But it was necessary in his method, and he loved it more than any other part of the process of painting. Looking at, taking in the subject, filling his eyes, enjoying the nuances and challenges, identifying the difficulties as quickly as possible, to be especially wary in sketching and in painting that there the bodies were buried. There were the details in which the devil lived. There were the spoilers of an otherwise masterpiece. Details. Tell us more. You got a minute before we sign off.
There's always a decision that has to be made each time. When you first introduce yourself to a subject and when you're ready to make the painting and in the act of the painting, which details are the ones that are the most compelling to me that I wanted to share because I want you to enjoy them too, or to see them too, or they're the ones that help make this subject interesting to look at or special in a unique way.
Ed Hopper and Joe lived in Cape Cod. They had neighbors who had a boat. The Hoppers had no boat. They borrowed this boat from the neighbors. And the neighbors had 2 children. I spoke with one of the children when he was grown up. And that man said that his sister his 8-year-old sister had been doing a little painting or crayon or something and asked Ed Hopper about painting, a tip on painting. And Ed Hopper gave her solemnly said, the main thing is what to leave out. And the other tip was, when is the painting done? When is the painting done?
Yeah.
Well, all we know is that the show is done because we're approaching that magic hour, end of an hour, and it's been a delight to converse with you. Very
My pleasure,
informative,
Wayne.
very,
Great to be with you.
Very educational. Thank you.
It's a lot of fun.
You're given a chance, if you have 30 minutes to address the world, 30 seconds. You have the last word. I'll let you have the last word. Please, something profound.
Something profound. Well, for me, it's been a profound journey to be able to enjoy making art. I've had the privilege of being an artist for 28 years. I've had an extraordinary privilege of coming to Cape Ann and being a part of an art colony that has such a long history, probably among the longest in the United States, with so many talented artists, with such great history, and amazing subject matter everywhere you look, and light. Cape Ann light. I love Cape Cod light. Cape Ann light seems to have just a little bit more specialness to it for me. And so I am deeply grateful for all the people who have been in the gallery, who have bought work, who have come in to have conversations with me, and who continue to allow me to do what I love best, which is to make paintings and to share them.
What a pleasure. Thank you once again for Gloucester Bookies, and hope to see you all the next time.
Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Alo vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Alo vepi, oho. Suukon kirsikka silmät niin mustat kuin yö. Ja ne loisti kuin tuikkiva tähtien työ.